And we're also going to make a crossbow today.
As we saw in the Cannibal Pot episode, Peter wants nothing more than a crossbow. In this episode, we built a crossbow that can fire 8 bolts. To make sure the crossbow fitted Peter, I had to measure him. I made the body of the crossbow out of some scrap 12mm plywood I had in my workshop. I drew up a roughly rifle-shaped profile on paper, keeping in mind the space I needed to make a trigger mechanism. I planned to make the body out of 3 pieces sandwiched together, but only needed to draw one profile since the others would be copies of the first one I made.
Okay, Peter, this is your, I had to measure, the reason I measured you is this has to be a kiddie size stock, right? There's a trigger mechanism, it's got a swivel in there.
I don't understand, how do you do the trigger? How do you pull the trigger?
There's a hole for the trigger, there's a trigger in there. It's a bit, I had to draw it a few times.
So you make a hole over here,
Yeah, and over there is a pin, and then I make that cut out. And then the line,
where do you cock it?
you cock it by pulling the rope over a recess over here. And when you fire and you pull the trigger, this trigger swivels up and then pushes the string over that, which then fires your bolt. The bolt sits like that. Like that. See there? And then when the string comes up, it goes.
Okay, it goes first like this, but then when you pull the string up, it goes like that, and then when you pull the trigger and then the string goes.
I'm gonna make a hole here and put a PVC pipe in there. So, shall we go cut it? Right?
Yep. Yes, I agree. Should we go cut it?
Yeah.
Yes.
The bandsaw is a great tool for cutting out a shape like this, but it could easily be done using a jigsaw or even a coping saw. The entire crossbow ended up being made from one piece of wood that I'm busy cutting here. After cutting, I had one side of my 3-piece laminate and gave it to Peter for a dress rehearsal.
His hand a bit forward. I know, but notice his hand. See, there's going to be the trigger over there. Okay, that should work. Right? Right size. Right? What do you think? Look at this. Right?
I left a lot of material on the barrel section so that I would have enough space to cut a bolt slide in the top, as well as have space to mount the PVC bow. The reason I made the crossbow out of 3 laminates was because of the trigger mechanism.
There's 2 halves. This is one half. This is the other half. And then we cut another section which goes in the middle. Yeah.
The centerpiece could be divided into 2 sections to enable a space to be created to mount the trigger assembly. I did a lot of research on YouTube and eventually settled on this idea, which is a simple L-shaped lever that would push the bowstring out of the slot and fire the bolt. I had to think up some sort of stop mechanism underneath the L-shaped lever to ensure the trigger did not fall back into the body of the crossbow. But before cutting out the trigger, I needed to cut out the middle section of the crossbow body. And there were some moments of comedy when Peter spotted his dad misassembling the parts he had himself just cut out. He very discreetly kept his opinion to himself.
Well, I can make this a bit. But before I do that, you see, I can drill a hole afterwards. But I want to make the trigger mechanism. It's quite important for this thing to be in there because I don't want the trigger to be too floppy inside. Anyway, I'll see. I'll see how I do that. So carry on with it tomorrow. I want to make sure I got it right. Yeah, I know. I think you're right. I think you're quite right. Like that. Yes.
It's even correct there.
No, it's a bit too long, but I can cut this off there. Cut this off.
Well, then I can put my finger into that hole.
Can you get your finger into that hole? So So there's space there for the trigger. Okay. I'm going to carry on tomorrow. I'm going to carry on tomorrow. It's getting, I can't see in there, it's too light.
I used a 32mm spade bit to drill the trigger finger hole. I then dry assembled the middle laminate and sanded the wood slightly to ensure a flush fit. I had to take care at this point because mistaken measurements could become very hard to correct. Peter, meanwhile, had decided to do some creative woodwork himself. What you making there?
A machete. I'm making a wooden machete.
You're sanding it down.
I'm sanding it down, sharp edge,
Uh-huh.
smooth handle, extremely smooth handle, and very flexible.
Very strong. That's a proper sword, eh?
It's a machete, not a sword.
Oh, machete, sorry, my mistake. You're doing a good job there, eh?
I've been doing this for like a lot of time. I've probably been doing it for like 30 minutes or so probably.
30 minutes. Okay, you keep it up. I'm also busy standing inside. And then we'll compare just now what we've done, okay?
Okay.
I'll show you what I've done. I'm just going to glue up your crossbow, okay? For this project I used a quick setting water-soluble wood glue. The idea was to apply a thin, even film of glue to both sides being bonded, and when I joined them to try to move them about to ensure the glue got evenly spread between the two surfaces. I like to use an old welding rod as a spreading tool, and this is also a useful tool to get glue at the bottom of the bottle. I had to glue carefully because I had to ensure I left enough space for my trigger and that the pieces were positioned correctly because this would affect the correct action of the trigger itself. Once the pieces were clamped, I used a small offcut of plywood to draw the L-shaped trigger piece. I cut it roughly to shape and gave it a good sanding to ensure the plywood thickness was a bit less than the other stock I used. If it isn't, the trigger would stick. Once this was done, I made a final check to see if the trigger fitted between the insets and also to check that there would be a finger space if the trigger was in the cocked position. Once a crossbow is ready to fire, it would not do to fumble to get a finger to find the trigger.
And I cut a slot.
Meanwhile, Peter had completed his project and was ready to give me a demonstration.
Bolt sits on top of here.
What you doing?
I've made the thing I showed you earlier,
Yeah,
but now I'm going to show it for its real purpose. You hold it like this,
yeah. Yo,
and it's made to stab someone in the back as a weapon.
that is like a throwing machete boomerang.
Yeah,
What if it comes back and hits you in the head?
and then it's bad luck.
The heart of the crossbow is the trigger. The pin around which it swivels is just a short piece of dowel and could be quite a loose fit. In fact, the trigger simply hangs on this dowel, which in turn is held in place by two blind holes drilled into the inside face of the two outer laminates. Seeing that the glue had dried, I could tackle the delicate business of drilling the trigger swivel pin holes. Positioning the trigger in just the right place is critical. Once I felt I had it right, I used an old screw to mark where I had to drill my swivel pin hole. I made sure to drill only a blind hole about 3/4 of the way through the laminate, but also had to ensure that I had drilled deep enough to give it some strength to the swivel pin. The next job was to drill the opposing hole for the swivel to mount in. To get the two holes to line up, I used a simple trick employing a nail. I positioned the nail inside the first hole I drilled. And then used the nail to make a mark on the inner face of the opposing laminate. I then drilled the second hole, making sure that my drill bit didn't penetrate right through to the opposite side. Once again, only 3/4 of the way through. Once I know that my pieces all line up properly and that the swivel swiveled freely, I felt I was ready to laminate the crossbow pieces together. One last job was to cut out the slot for the bowstring to slot into, making sure I removed the trigger before doing so. Right, finally the laminating. I enjoy gluing things together and wasn't paying attention to a lurking mistake. This could have cost me the entire project. I had made a mistake at this point. It was Peter who spotted it, and luckily I could correct it before gluing on the final pieces. As usual, I had misplaced this crucial item, and as usual, Peter came to the rescue.
Thank you.
After clamping the body, I knocked off to allow the glue to dry overnight.
Explain that to me again.
Okay. Once I make the crossbow,
I like to involve my son in the making of projects, so I always take the time to discuss what we plan to do, even if it means weaseling out of what he thinks I should be doing.
Shut up and sit down.
Sanding the body of the crossbow is important. There is a lot of energy unleashed when it is fired, and the string catching on any loose fibers or plywood laminate can cause serious injury. Peter did the last and final quality check before we tackled the bolt slide and the bow itself. For the bow, I used a section of 20mm PVC irrigation pipe. Usually you would have been used in the making of crossbows, but since this is a toy, I wanted to stick to commonly available scrap materials. I opted to use PVC pipe. Mounting this pipe was a simple matter of drilling a fairly snug hole and then fixing it loosely with a nail hammered through it into the body of the crossbow. Before moving on to the bolt slide, I had to make sure that the bowstring catch was nicely smooth and rounded. There could be no loose wood fibers in this area. The first blank firing. The bolts are made from 8mm dowels. To cut the slide, I marked off a 12mm groove that I cut on a table saw. I had to use a spacer to make up for the curve of the stock and set the blade to cut 4mm into the body of the crossbow. The idea being to let the string hit the bolt dead center when the string gets released. Plywood can be very hard to cut vertically to the grain. I did 2 passes to cut 2 evenly spaced parallel saw cuts. I had to take great care not to cut my sacred trigger mechanism. The slide should be finished off absolutely smoothly because the bowstring had to have an absolutely clear run. The first test bolt was frighteningly successful. Peter was enormously happy with the crossbow, even if we were simply firing dowels without any real fletching. Peter is able to load and fire this crossbow, but I was still surprised at how much power is stored in this toy. Crossbows, even toy ones, are dangerous weapons. I made the slide in such a way that the bolt falls out of the bow if it is moved about in any way. This is to stop Peter running about with the weapon loaded and accidentally shooting someone. Common sense and responsibility is part of ownership of any weapon, and parents need to ensure that their children are mature enough and ready to use dangerous weapons like these. To check the bolts, I cut very simple shapes out of material. These were then mounted in slots cut lengthways into the bolts. The tips of the bolts were left blunt for safety reasons. Eventually I managed to wrestle the crossbow off Peter for painting. It needed paint to protect the wood and also to teach Peter the importance and satisfaction of completing a project. Peter painted the bolts red to make them easier to find, and the fletching was painted as well to keep the material from unraveling. We spent a pleasant afternoon painting a very enjoyable project.